For episode 6 of Women in STEM, we're joined by Dr. Krystal Evans. Now, Dr. Evans is the CEO of the Bio-Melbourne Network, a membership association for organisations engaged in biotechnology, medical technology and health innovation in the Melbourne area. She has been involved in cutting-edge research into a malaria cure and can be heard often on the Melbourne Community Radio Science program Einstein A Go-Go on 3RRR. Anyway, let's find out how Dr. Evans first discovered her passion for science.
I think I've always been into science. When I was at primary school, we had a school disco, and here am I, 11 years old, and the theme of the school disco was come as something starting with the letter S. And so my classmates all came as superheroes and singers and soccer players, and I rocked up to my primary school disco dressed as a scientist. So I think ever since I was very young, I've always had a really incredible interest in science, but really that came from the fact that my parents were both science teachers, and my mum in particular. And so when I was growing up, my mum would do science experiments with us at home. I mean, I grew up in kind of a semi-rural regional area, and so mum would be off down the local abattoir picking up cows' eyes and for her class to dissect. So of course, yeah, but I was doing it on my kitchen table when I was 7. And mum would bring home the heart and lungs out of a cow, and I distinctly remember blowing with rubber piping and inflating these lungs on our kitchen table. So I guess I had a very experiential kind of introduction to science through my mother.
So is that what led you into biological sciences, that first introduction to them through, inflating lungs and all the rest of it?
Yeah, I think so. Though interestingly, I didn't study biology at high school. I chose to do chemistry, physics and mathematics. And again, I had a really strong cohort of other friends at school, girls around me, who also did those subjects. And actually, I was thinking about it today. I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. Jodie's dad was an engineer and Emily's dad was an engineer and my parents are science teachers. So I think parents do play a really strong role in shaping their children's subject selections at high school. It's clearly the case with me and some of the other people in my kind of peer group as we went through high school together. And so then when I went to university, I really decided that I wanted to get into medical science. And so I undertook a medical chemistry degree at my hometown university, the University of Wollongong.
Okay.
And it was interesting because I was a couple of years into my degree and I realised that even though I loved science, I really hated being in the lab. And I thought, this is a bit of a problem. What am I going to do? Like, how can I be a scientist if I hate being in the lab? Because I went to all my undergraduate practical classes and just thought they were the worst part of my week. And so I actually went to my course supervisor, and I think this is where having really great mentors comes into it. An excellent medicinal chemist by the name of Dr. Joanne Jamie. And Joanne was my mentor, and I said, look, I just don't know if this is for me. I mean, I think I like science, but I really hate being in the lab. And she said, why don't you come and spend some time in my research group? And I was like, really? Because I was about second year. And so I just went and did a week in her lab. And, she gave me some quite straightforward chemical reaction to set up. But I realised that I loved being in the lab when I was doing an investigator-led research project. What I didn't like was undergraduate prac class, and that's probably not surprising.
You don't have not the grinding work. You like the fun stuff.
Yeah, but also I think it's also that idea of the unknown. I guess if you're doing a prac class, you're doing something that everyone's done 1,000 times. It's part of the curriculum. You know the experiment works. You've just got to kind of do it and get it done. You don't really discover anything. But for me, the real joy of being in the lab was the feeling that I'm about to do something no one else has ever done. I'm about to set up an experiment. I don't know what will happen. No one knows what will happen. I'll have to come in tomorrow and find out. And so for me, that was really what drove my passion for research. And that again, so I spent 1 week working in Dr. Jamie's lab. And then I went back for summer scholarships. I went back for more research projects. I did my honours year. And I just felt that if it wasn't for her mentorship and her guidance, that I might have quit at that point. So, yeah, I think a big life lesson for me was it's really important to have mentors, but on the other foot, it's really important to be a mentor as well. So I think that's something that I think I've really taken with me through my career is how to not only reach out for my mentors, but to reach out to mentor others.
So you were sort of shown that sort of light at the end of the tunnel, that sort of, here's the drudgery that you might have to go through for while you're doing your actual study, but here's the cool stuff you can do at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I did a lot of reading when I left my undergraduate degree, and I decided that I really wanted to tackle a big problem, like what are some of the big challenges, the big wicked problems in the world? And for me, malaria was one of those, and that's what led me to do my PhD, working in the area of malaria vaccine development. And I actually moved to Melbourne for that. So I grew up in Wollongong, but I feel like I became a grown up when I moved to Melbourne, which is now my adopted and much loved home city.
You decided to stick up. You decided to get into malaria. What was it about malaria research that really attracted you?
I think it was the fact that it was such an incredibly devastating disease that affected people in some of the poorest parts of the world, and that there was no vaccine available for something that killed hundreds of millions of people each year, particularly women and children, and that the drugs that we were using for malaria were rapidly becoming ineffective. Just as bacteria become resistant to antibiotics, the malaria parasites were becoming resistant to the drugs. And so I just felt it was a huge area of need. And for me, the fact there was no vaccine available, was a real big global challenge. And so I found out that Melbourne was a capital city for malaria research, and I came down here and I interviewed and was fortunate enough to be accepted into a PhD program at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, where I did my PhD, and I really enjoyed my time there. It was interesting. I mean, this podcast is about women in science, and I had such a great cohort at the WEHI. When I started, we were a pretty big group. There's about 22 of us who all started our PhDs at the same time, which nowadays is about the size of the institute, but back then that was quite a big group. And it was about 75% women, about 25% men. And I thought, wow, there is no problem for women in science. We're all here in the room. And interestingly, when I look back now and reflect on how many of those women are still in academic research and how many of those men are still in academic research, I'd have to say that 90% of the women have probably gone on to careers outside of academia, whereas maybe 80 to 90% of those men who are in that first initial PhD group are probably still there. So,
Sorry, go on.
It's not a pipeline issue. There's an issue in there about retaining women in academia and in academic research careers that I think hasn't really been addressed.
That's starting to be a little bit of a theme across so you're the fifth woman that I've interviewed so far, and that's starting to become a little bit of a theme, this idea that it's getting very hard. Women into early mid-career research, okay, we can get them there, but we can't hold on to them.
Yeah, and it's interesting to sort of maybe pick that apart a bit, because every woman I speak to who is in that cohort, myself included, because I'm no longer an academic research scientist, has chosen to leave. And so it's this sort of conflict where it's like, oh, how do we keep women there? It's like, well, we keep women there by creating an environment in which they want to stay, I guess. And it sounds a little bit trite, but the fact that you're creating a research system that clearly has these biases or barriers that challenge particular groups of people more than others, is very apparent in the results that we see kind of coming out the other end. And so sometimes I think that, it is fantastic to encourage more girls and more women, but in areas like biology, but we also see it outside of science in areas like law. It's not a pipeline issue. And stuffing more women in at one end doesn't mean they're going to pop out the other end. We really have to focus on, what's happening in that system that's not rewarding and valuing those kind of diverse contributions that are made by people from different diverse backgrounds.
So you haven't just experienced the Australian academic environment, you've gone overseas as well, haven't you?
Yes. When I finished my PhD, I really saw a PhD as my passport to the world. And I guess it's a very common career trajectory for early career researchers is you do your PhD in Australia, you get postdoc position, a postdoctoral research position overseas, whether that's in the US, Europe, Canada, the UK, and go abroad for a few years and come back again with some new experience and new knowledge and new networks. And so I was lucky enough to apply to do some postdoctoral work in the UK. And at the time, the professor I wanted to work with was at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I thought, brilliant, I'll move to London. And then in the process of applying to work in his laboratory, he took a chair up at the University of York, up in northern England, in deepest, darkest Yorkshire. So I didn't quite end up in cosmopolitan London, but I had an incredibly good time at the University of York. They have one of the best biology schools in the UK. And it really was a rewarding time for me as a scientist, but also personally as well, being able to live and work overseas. And so for me, a PhD was absolutely my passport to the world in that respect.
It does seem to be, kind of the odd place to go and research tropical medicine is York.
Yeah, no, there's not a lot of tropical disease in Yorkshire, thankfully. And that's the other thing, is that people say the same thing about Melbourne. It's just like when you think of tropical medicine, you don't think of Melbourne. But this is where we've got the skills and the capability. And I guess it's because to study tropical diseases, you really have to have a good understanding of immunology and basic biology. And so you start to build up these capabilities around these very fundamental areas of science, and then you start to apply them to where the most urgent problems are. And in that case, it's around sort of what we call neglected tropical diseases. So the diseases that aren't getting enough scientific attention in terms of developing new cures and new therapies.
They're not sexy ones.
Yeah, they're quite unsexy. The disease I worked on when I was in the UK was called leishmania, and it's commonly referred to as a flesh-eating parasite. And it causes these incredibly ugly skin lesions in your arms. There's another kind that infects the tissues of your nose and your ears, and basically, literally eats away at your face. So, and because it's not a killer, it doesn't really get a lot of high profile because it doesn't kill millions of people. But what it does do is cause profound disability and impaired quality of life for people who, end up unable to use limbs, unable to walk. There are forms of the disease that are fatal, but a lot of the time it just creates these chronic long-term illnesses where people just waste away. And so in terms of lifting regional and developing economies, one of the best things we could do would be to eradicate some of these quite devastating diseases that really hold communities back.
So Melbourne has sort of, as you were saying, this sort of intersection of, immunology, expertise and all the rest of it. There's quite a large disease research thing going on in Melbourne, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, a lot of it comes from our post-World War II efforts, because Australia was cut off in certain ways from the rest of the world during World War I and World War II. And so we had to develop our own capabilities around the diseases that would impact our troops. And so there was actually a really strong scientific community that kind of came together through the First and Second World Wars, when things like antibiotics were discovered and developed. I didn't realise that Australia, through CSL, our oldest pharmaceutical company, was one of the first countries where penicillin was manufactured not only for troops but also for the general populace. So there's this, because we had to develop the capability to make and manufacture the antibiotic here ourselves, and then we became so expert at it that we actually had enough to then offer it to the general population for infection, for the first time outside of being used in the armed forces. And a lot of that came from our malaria work as well, because I don't think people realise that malaria is still a big problem in some of our closest and nearest neighbours. Papua New Guinea still has malaria as one of its leading causes of death and disease, and they're just off the off the coast really. And so more soldiers died of malaria than bullets in Papua New Guinea, World War II, and so I think because a lot of the scientific effort in Australia was redirected to support our troops, we developed all these capabilities around infectious diseases, and particularly infectious diseases important in our region. So there's some fascinating history and philosophy of science behind why Australia, even though we don't have any malaria ourselves anymore, has become a real global hub for malaria research and discovery.
So what was the highlight of your malarial research? Now, I've gone through your LinkedIn, I've gone through everything else, because I have to do some research for this show. I can't just call up every now and then and just call strange scientist women out of the blue. What was the highlight of your work with malaria?
Oh, for me, it was starting a project with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that's now actually still ongoing and is heading in towards the clinical trials. So I guess as a researcher, and particularly when I worked on such an important area of malaria, I got a bit jaded with the academic cycle of writing a paper to publishing a paper to write a grant, to publish a paper to write the next grant, to get the research done, to write the paper, and getting stuck in this kind of academic cycle where
it sounds a bit like the lady who swallowed the fly.
It is, and you get stuck on this productivity track where your productivity is how many academic research papers you publish and how many grants you get, rather than how many lives you save. Mm-hmm. And I know that that's a little bit idealistic, but when you're writing a grant that says malaria kills 150 million people a year, and then here's all my research and why you should fund it because this will save lives, you've actually got to start to think about how you're going to deliver on that end piece. And so for me, getting some funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who have a strong investment in child and maternal health, and malaria being a disease that predominantly kills pregnant women and children under the age of 5, they have a really strong malaria research program. For me, their focus was not publishing papers, it was getting results. And so for me, that was a huge mind shift in my career, because it was not just, why are you doing this project because it's academically interesting and cool and exciting and get to use all this new tech. It's how are you actually going to develop this and deliver this and translate this into something that's useful for the people who are, suffering and dying. And so for me, that was a real mind shift around how you not just do research, but you do development. And that's where I got a glimpse of the world of commercialization, of product development, of translating your research into something that has real world applications. And to me, that's the definition of innovation. Like, innovation is such a buzzword at the moment, but really innovation is about taking an idea and turning it into something that can have impact. And a grant or a research paper is not going to have impact in the same way that actually making a vaccine or formulating a new drug will. And so for me, the highlight of my career was kicking off a project with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that is now actually going into clinical trials probably late this year, early next year. Even though I'm no longer involved in the project, I'm still incredibly proud of the small role I played in being able to move that piece of research out of the lab and into reality.
So from that glimpse of working in non-academia, working for, I guess you could call it private enterprise or the private research area.
It was more philanthropic, but yeah, it was more, how do you actually, because people talk about going from bench to bedside. How do we move a medical discovery, from the lab to the patient? And they don't realise that business sits in between. You've kind of got to go from bench to business to bedside. Otherwise, it's not going to be a product that is useful to a patient, to a doctor, to a public health organisation, unless it's, you can't take something out of a Petri dish. It's got to be something you can take off the shelf.
You can't just whack that mouldy bread onto a wound. You need to actually produce something from it.
Yeah, and so for me, that opened up a whole new world. I kind of went, wow, there's actually this whole other world out here that as an academic research scientist I really didn't see. Like this whole world of biotechnology, of pharmaceuticals, of R&D, where the focus is on the D, like the development piece. How you actually turn a great piece of research into a great product that actually can be used to, support great policy to actually, achieve those health outcomes that are so desperately needed. And so for me, it was a real natural move then to start to say, well, how do I play in that world? There's so many great academic research scientists in Australia. I could be one of them, and I was one of them, but to actually be part of moving that research into reality, how do I become part of that? For me, that became the next big challenge.
So that sort of leads into the Bio Melbourne network. What is that?
Yes, so the BioMelbourne Network are a Melbourne-based industry association who support biotechnology companies, pharmaceutical companies, medical technology companies in doing that R&D and that product development and that commercialisation, taking something that's a piece of research all the way through to a product that's on market, that's available, that can be prescribed, that can be purchased, that can be implemented. And so my role as the CEO of the BioMelbourne Network is really to support what I call the innovation ecosystem here in Melbourne, taking all those bits and pieces, because that's the other thing, is that one company can't take one product all the way to market on their own. It's all about partnerships. It's partnering with universities, it's about partnering with pharmaceutical companies. So much is outsourced these days. It's about getting all those people who run the clinical trials, who do the compound analysis, who do the formulation and manufacturing, how you actually bring all those capabilities together in a city to actually, turn great ideas into great outcomes.
Okay, so here you are, it's 2016, you're the CEO of BioMelbourne, you've done all this work on malaria, and you've done some really good work on malaria, and you've experienced all these different parts of research development. Where do you want to go from here?
Oh, the answer to that is I don't know. It's very exciting. I guess for me, I've learned so much in my time as a CEO at BioMelbourne Network about the opportunities that exist out there. And I have to say that, again, as an academic research scientist, you have no idea of the diversity of jobs that are available. And it kind of makes me angry when people talk about it's a waste that so many people have left science. And it's like, you haven't left science because you've left academic research. In fact, it's interesting to look at the biotech sector. The biotech sector is powered by women. When you look at biotech companies, some of them have again, 70 or 80% women working in those environments. And something about me what makes me wonder, I think, is there something about the way in which working in a different professional environment that values different criteria and values different contributions is more attractive to women than staying in the academic research environment where success is very narrowly defined. Mm-hmm. And contributions and value are measured very specifically, whereas in industry there's such a diversity of roles that I find that a lot of women who've stepped away from academic research find incredible value and real passion for working in areas like business development and product development and commercialization, using their science but applying it to a different part of the problem, not just the discovery side.
First up, a big thank you to Dr. Evans. Now, before we finish up, I would like to ask you, dear listener, to do me a favour. Could you please leave a review of this podcast on iTunes? It helps let people know that it exists, and it's always nice to hear what people think about it. Oh, and if you know a woman involved in the STEM areas who you think would be good for this podcast, please let me know. You can contact me via email at james@angrybeanie.com. Anyway, the music, as always, is Coco Cura by Texas Radiofish and is licensed Creative Commons Attribution. You can find it at dig.ccmixter.org. See you next time.